Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Coming Out in Football session tonight. My name is Jason Webber. I'm the Equality, Diversity, Inclusion and Integrity Manager at the Football Association of Wales, and really glad and happy to be joined by some fantastic guests tonight, which I'll introduce. The first person, who is a late substitution, is Tracy Brown, who is the co-chair of Chelsea Pride, also the Rainbow Wall as well, and is also involved in Pride in Football. So thanks for joining us tonight, Tracy.
Lovely to be here.
Second up, we have Harry Messenger. And now Harry's a footballer at the Cardiff Dragons, who are the first and only LGBTQ football club within Wales. So thanks for joining us tonight, Harry.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Natalie Washington. Now, Natalie is a footballer at Rushmore Community Football Club and is also the campaign lead for Football vs Transphobia as well. So likewise, thanks for joining us, Natalie.
Thank you, good to be here.
Brilliant. And last but not least is Lou Englefield. And now Lou is the director of Football vs Homophobia and also Pride Sports. So a real pleasure to have Lou with us tonight as well.
Nice to see you.
Brilliant, fantastic. Now tonight, as I said, is part of a panel discussion around coming out within football, and looking for everyone who's listening in tonight on where we can play a role in trying to support any individuals throughout that process, and using football as a way to sort of, to support them throughout that journey as well. We're going to be hearing from some of the experiences that our panelists have had throughout their own journeys, or sort of their involvement within football and what that has sort of supported and led to throughout their time as well. And we're really going to start off around that, really, around looking at sort of what is your experiences, or what has your experiences been, either of coming out or of being out within football, both in terms of positive or negative. So I don't know whether, Natalie, maybe do you want to start us off with talking about some of your experiences?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So, yeah, I mean, actually, I'm pleased to say, I guess, that most of my experiences have been positive. I'm obviously a trans woman. I transitioned in started social transition, if you want to call it that, in I think 2013, 14. And prior to that, I'd played men's football. And I didn't really do much in the way of coming out whilst I was still playing men's football. And I think that probably speaks to a lot. But actually, I thought, at that point, I thought kind of football was done for me. I thought I probably wouldn't be able to carry on. But actually then, a couple of years later, I really missed football and wanted to get back into it. And so I approached my local club and said, look, I'm a trans woman. Can I come and play women's football? Is that going to be cool? And really pleased to say that actually, the response I got was really positive. And speaking to lots of trans people who have got involved in the game in different ways, it feels like that's quite a common experience, which is really good. It's not a universal experience, to be clear, but it's quite common. So yeah, they just said, come down. We don't know what the rules are. We'll work it out. But I was able to get involved. And I think since then, my overriding experience has been that of positivity. I've had, one of the things I was really worried about and very scared about, honestly, was, is there going to be resistance from opposition teams? Is there going to be people going to say you shouldn't be here, or people going to say, you shouldn't be trying to play sport or whatever? Honestly hasn't really happened. I've had one or two games where there's been a bit of hostility. I think on one occasion it was definitely down to me being trans. On one occasion, I think it was just honestly a bit of a hostile team. It does happen. But yeah, I think, in terms of getting resistance and stuff like that, I've been really pleased to say I haven't honestly had too much of that. But I think what I have had is really good, positive outcomes for myself. I've met friends through football. I've got involved in stuff like this through football, which I never would have got involved in otherwise. I found a community through football and felt more connected to my local area. And, the football club where I am, it's quite sort of a suburban town, I guess, if you will. It's quite a key part of the community, so it really feels like you're a bit more connected to what's going on. And I've met loads of great people through it. So yeah, it's been a really positive experience, actually.
Brilliant, thanks, Natalie, for sharing your experiences here. Harry is another former player. Have you had similar experiences to Natalie, or different? What's your journey been?
Yeah, I suppose I've had quite good experiences as well, I guess, because well, I suppose it helped that I joined Cardiff Dragons back in 2015. 2015 or 2016, I want to say, when I was sort of at the early stage of figuring out my gender identity and things and coming out as trans. And then they've sort of, being an LGBT inclusive club, they've sort of helped with that journey. So they've sort of seen where it was when I started until now, kind of thing. And sort of, I feel like I've not really needed much support and stuff from them, but being able to be in a space to play football and sort of not have to worry about transphobia or other scenarios happening as such has helped. And I suppose with opposition as well, we're lucky that our main sort of league is the GFSN league, which is like an LGBT mixed team league. So rules like certain things regarding who can and can't play. I think as long as everyone's over 18, then it doesn't matter what gender, sexuality, or anything you are. The other teams like share that ethos, I suppose. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks for sharing. And it's good to hear that your experiences football has been something that's been supportive and the environment been right to allow you guys through your journey of coming out and to be your sort of true authentic selves. Tracy, I wonder what your sort of experiences have been within the game.
Actually, I mean, I come out when I was really, really young and was just a football supporter back then. I first came out when I was sort of 15, 16. So now I feel very old saying that. So for years, I was just a football supporter. And then when I started sort of working on running groups, and I started by officially setting up Portsmouth's Frat and Fever, that was one of the first things I did. And then when I moved to actually my own team, I realised there was a really fantastic community behind it. And I think that's one of the most positive parts for me, is all the people I've met through all of the work I've done, and it's taken away from the negatives that you do sometimes get with people who don't believe our groups should exist and think, you know, we're ruining football by trying to make it inclusive, because apparently we are ruining football by trying to do that. So actually the community I felt, being my authentic self with that community, has actually really helped me grow as a person. So yeah, really good positives.
Lou, I know you're part of a really important campaign around trying to make sure that everyone's experiences are positive, like the guys have shared so far, but your own personal experiences similar or not so much?
Well, I think one of the things is that, like, I'm so old that I came out 30 odd years ago. So talking about my coming out experience, if this was like a historical, event, then that might be kind of quite useful. But I think the thing for me to say is that, we tend to think of coming out as a kind of one-time thing, but here I am at 54 telling you that actually it isn't. So, my experience in football, I suppose, has been really interesting. I did community coaching for many years, and, I would be in an environment where I would be open. People knew that I was a lesbian, and I would be kind of quite comfortable in that coaching environment, coaching children that I knew, on the team of my kids at the local school. So it was kind of nice and safe in that sense. But then I would find that every time I kind of stepped out of that environment, I'd have to do that new calculation of like, right, am I going to come out to these people? What's this going to be like? How am I going to be received? And I did all my coaching in England before I came back to Wales, but the last team I coached wasn't kind of connected to my family. I was just asked to volunteer by some women in the local community where I lived, and I started coaching this team. And I just remember feeling kind of quite nervous about how parents would. It was a team that was linked to a local Catholic school. I wondered how parents would receive me as, an out queer person. So I just feel like, we come out, even when we come out in football, we come out one time but then that isn't, you know, that isn't going to be our football environment forever, is it? You know, it's going to change, and then we have to go through all that kind of risk assessing all over again, really.
Yeah, thanks, Lewis. Some really important points there. I think it leads quite nicely into the next sort of part that I wanted to talk about, around what are some of the challenges that sort of people face, you know, trying to be their true selves within football. And you mentioned sometimes it's that multiple levels of that, where it's almost every time in a new environment, in a new team, in a new setting as well. And Natalie, I wonder whether, you know, what are some of the challenges, whether that be for trans individuals or sort of more broadly as well, what your thoughts are?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because there are, I guess, some obviously very specific challenges around trans people, which is, you know, it's been kind of in the news, feels to me, constantly for the last 5 years, which is, you know, how should trans people get involved in sport, or how does society want to allow trans people to get involved in sport? Because of course trans people should get involved in sport, right? It's sport is a human right, and yeah. But obviously for trans people, and I guess it's different depending on where you are in the, you know, what your gender identity is, but there are hard barriers, there are policy barriers that people need to, you know, make sure that they are often consistent with medicalised policies around inclusion, yeah, and that's obviously there, which, you know, I took me 18 months to meet the criteria, for example, to be able to play. So I think sometimes people think it's very easy. It's not necessarily easy. So that's one. I think there's barriers that we face, and there's barriers that we create for ourselves. So I've talked about one barrier that we face, and another one is, you know, it's like I said, it's scary when you go and approach a club, and Lou's just talked to that as well. You know, like, it's, am I going to be received well? Is someone going to have a problem with me being there? Or is there going to be someone who maybe doesn't overtly have a problem with me being there, but wants to create something of a hostile atmosphere, or wants to, you know, place softer barriers in my way to make it more difficult for me to be there? You know, am I going to get picked? All that kind of stuff. But I think there's also stuff like we create barriers for ourselves. I've got some food arrived. We create barriers for ourselves sometimes in our mind, where we worry that, because of what I've just described, we worry that we're going to face a barrier, and so we'll self-exclude. And so we might say, okay, well, I don't really want to deal with coming out to all these people, so I'm just not going to go. Or I don't really want to deal with questions around, if I'm a non-binary person, perhaps I don't want to deal with questions around what my birth assignment was, or what my gender identity is, and what category I should play in. So I'm just gonna leave that alone. And so I think, actually, I don't want to oversell that sometimes the barriers we face are self-imposed, because they're barriers that we've imposed on ourselves because of how we think people are going to react to us. But I think there's both ways of looking at it. And I think we'll probably come on to talk about this, but, you know, there's ways which we can help people feel more confident about that.
I think it's an interesting point you spoke about. There's actual barriers, real barriers, and there's also barriers that potentially could be perceived barriers, but they're still very real to that individual, and just as challenging, I think, is a really important point that you made with that. They definitely. Tracy, from a fan's point of view, then, you know, what are some of the challenges then for, you know, fans, sort of worries, challenges they might have with going and watching the games in the stadiums from whichever team that they follow?
Yes, I think one of the biggest things, I suppose, is homophobic chanting that you do get at football games. As far as a fan experience goes, go into a game, abusive language in any form and all forms of discrimination seem to be readily available in songs when you're at any ground. So yeah, I definitely think that can wreck someone's fan experience. And also, unlike me, I'm thick-skinned. I think I've heard it all in football. If you've just come out and you're maybe going to your first game, I'm going to pick Chelsea for an example, and you know, you're a young lad who's just come out and you're hearing the Chelsea Rent Boy chant consistently in the stands, that is going to make you feel uncomfortable. It makes me feel uncomfortable, and it would make most people feel uncomfortable. So yes, there is negatives, unfortunately, when you do go to stadiums, and that's why we as groups challenge that behaviour and challenge working with authorities to do so. And that's the big thing, is challenging authorities to make the difference, to get behind campaigns, the likes of what Lou runs with Football v Homophobia and all of the campaigns behind that. It's a challenge that we face every single day, and a challenge that I think we're going to face for some time to come. It's just breaking down that negativity.
I think it's interesting around chants and terms, and even though certain terms of chants are not directed at an individual in the stands, but very much by pure association, words can carry such hatred and real weight and power.
Yeah, they do.
Historical context, yeah, definitely, and again, be just as damaging as well. Harry, while you've sort of highlighted that, fortunately you're in a club and environment where I suppose some of those challenges and fears hopefully are sort of alleviated to an extent. But hypothetically, if you had a phone call to go and play for a higher tier club and we'll be going out to that environment, what do you think some of the challenges might be for yourself then, or others in those situations?
Yeah, I think because we're such a grassroots club, like you said, I'm sort of quite lucky in that respect. But I think if I was to be in a more like competitive club, like Natalie said, there would be like medical barriers, and I think there's all.
You froze a second there, Harry.
Because of having to educate. They're frozen.
Go on, you're back now. Go on.
So if I was at another club, it'd sort of, I feel like there'd potentially for people to almost explain what being trans is and all that kind of thing, rather than just going there to play football, and sort of sometimes it can be exhausting having to explain to everyone that you're trans.
Yeah, I think the key point out is that it shouldn't be always on the individual, should it? And that's hopefully certainly something that we're trying to do, and providing opportunities like this tonight is to educate and for people to learn, and then not just be on the individuals that it's about as such. So I think that's certainly some important points here as well. Lou, again, from a campaigning sort of perspective as well, and also personally, what are some of the challenges that all of the people that you've engaged with and spoken to over the years have had within the game?
Wow, I suppose that's like a huge question, because I think what we have to think about kind of like homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, is that it intersects football at every single level. And so therefore we need to tackle exclusion at every single level. So for me to kind of think, right, what are the issues, what are the barriers? There will be barriers at every single level, and those might be, actual kind of physical barriers, so that you've got to meet a load of requirements, like Natalie says, in terms of meeting policy demands if you're a trans player. So there might be things like that. There might be things, for example, like, if you are a non-binary person, having to choose between a male or a female playing environment, no gender neutral facilities, being forced into a gender category that you don't want to participate in. I mean, one of the things, just talking about that particularly, is that we know that Sport Wales undertook some school research, I think in 2018, and they found that the experience of young people who identified as something other than male or female in school sport and PE was significantly worse than their male or female counterparts, and that's backed up by other evidence and other research. So we know there are barriers there for non-binary people. We also know that in terms of, for example, in the men's game, there's a disparity between attitudes. That people are less homophobic than they used to be, but in men's sport, that homophobia is the go-to slur. And so language doesn't change, and that can still be really intimidating, as Tracy has described. And one of the things that I've experienced in football, in much of the education work that I've done as well, is persistent stereotypes around lesbians, and whether lesbians are suitable role models, for example. I've had allegations levelled, not at me personally, but at lesbians in the game about their suitability as role models for young girls. Don't they just want to turn young girls into lesbians, is something that was kind of levelled at me a couple of years ago, you know, in an education piece that I was doing. So, you know, there are issues that we need to be dealing with, and to kind of summarize all of those in one sentence is a bit tricky.
Yeah, and you did a good job of it, Leo. But no, I think you're right. I think that, and again, anyone listening in who might be part of clubs or whatever role that might be, you know, we all have an opportunity and a role to play with breaking down some of those stereotypes that have existed for far longer than they should have, and unfortunately still prevalent today. But yeah, some really important points in there. Just to know for anyone listening in, you can use the Q&A feature down below to ask any questions to the panel. We will be taking some questions at the end of the session, so at any point just drop your questions into there. I wonder that, you know, trying to shift it hopefully towards more of a positive focus on trying to move forward. But what are some of the changes that you would like to see to make football in Wales a more inclusive place for everyone? So again, everyone can sort of see a place and have that environment where they truly feel that they belong. And again, going back to the idea about being their authentic self. So Natalie, I'll come to you, and I know obviously you don't play within Wales, but in football, I suppose in general, you know, what are some of the changes that maybe you've seen that have started, or where you know, some clubs, some environments are doing some good things that have been effective, or that we still need to see happen?
Yeah. Yeah, as you say, obviously I don't play my football in Wales, but it's a pretty universal thing, I think, in terms of, you know, the asking the question. I think, look, I suppose I've got a high end scale, looking at the ways and the patterns in which people engage with football and the ways that people start getting into the game. You know, I guess from a playing perspective, it's looking at what different ways can we offer football that might be more inclusive of some people. You know, we've talked about non-binary people. Of course, football is typically almost universally categorized into the men's game and the women's game, right? So how might we look at different ways of provisioning the game that makes it easier for people to get involved? And of course, that's beneficial for non-binary people, but actually that's beneficial for a lot of people, because, for example, if you're in a small town, like, could you get a futsal league going with, if you only just restricted it to one gender, but actually maybe if you do it mixed, there's more chance of getting it off the ground. A lot of the women that I play football with, and of course a lot of these were kids 10, 15 years ago, but they say one of the best things they did growing up was they were able to play football with boys, and actually part of that was probably they got access to better coaching and better facilities by playing boys football. I'm sure that's better now, it's not perfect, but still, just that wider group of people maybe improves their game, but also actually maybe people can play football with people that they want to play football with. You know, they can play football with a brother or a sister that they couldn't otherwise play with. You know, so I think those more inclusive ways of looking at provisioning the game is one thing. I think the GFSN league that Harry's mentioned is a good example of that, where you can actually, by allowing mixed football, means that more people can get involved in the game. Like, for example, trans women don't have to worry about getting blood tests a couple of times a year in order to comply with a policy, which at an elite level might make sense, but if you're just playing at a sort of participation level, maybe it's not as important. So I think that's one thing. I mean, maybe kind of outside of playing, Tracy can probably speak better to this than me, but I think there's lots of really good initiatives around providing ways for LGBT people to get involved in the game. So like finding, and I suppose this works for playing as well actually, but groups where you can go to games with people. So that helps people make that first step that they might be nervous about, going along with someone that they know they're going to be safe with. Stuff like that works really well. So I think providing these pathways, and I think getting more of a connection between sport and LGBT groups that might be already in existence, to help people kind of find that safe pathway to get into the game. Because like we've talked about this, there's a lot of LGBT people that have a difficult relationship with sport because of some of the stuff that Lou's just described. I think those safe ways, those safe connections, sort of familiar faces that help guide people in can be really powerful.
Yeah, it's really, really important point here, Natalie, and I think it's interesting that particularly over the last year or so, we've seen a couple of countries across Europe actually extend. So, for example, in Wales, you can play mixed football up to 16, but we've seen a couple of other countries extend up to 19s and even sort of 20, 21s, 23s. So it seems that that's a little bit of a trend that's starting, and potentially might come to Wales. I don't know. But I think it's certainly something to explore. And I think you're right. I think it's having that provision, particularly at a recreational level or sort of amateur grassroots level, whereby there's a provision there that sort of mitigates some of those challenges that particularly trans people or non-binary people have in participating within football as well. Tracy, I suppose Natalie started to touch on some of the fans elements of it. Obviously, we set up the Rainbow Wall and launched it back in March of this year. The sole idea of that was very much to try and create some visibility, but having a group of individuals from the LGBTQ community and also allies to come together to try and sort of create that safe environment and safety in numbers, I suppose, to an extent, to try and encourage those who follow the Cymru national teams, but maybe have never had the confidence to go to games to hopefully try and do that. So I do wonder whether you want to add anything in terms of what are some of the changes or how can we further improve that environment?
I think Natalie actually covered it perfectly. I think it really helps actually being able to go to a game, definitely if you've never done that before, with like-minded people and people you feel safe to go with. I think having LGBT supporter groups, be it whether it's country, be it whether for your team, and obviously I know obviously in Wales we have LGBTQ groups for different teams that play football. It's fantastic. It gives a form of protection, and for some people that's definitely needed. And it may make them actually go, I don't want to just watch this on television. Actually, I'd like to be able to go to a game and actually experience a game and feel safe to do so. That's one thing that's fantastic about obviously the Rainbow Wall. Obviously, we have some big games coming up, and of which is just getting a group of people together to do an actual physical launch because we've done our first one online, and it'll be great because, as I say, the people you meet online and that we've spent time together with online will actually be able to meet face to face for the first time because we've now got around COVID slightly, and to actually make a difference and welcome people who, as I say, have never come to football before. So it's definitely a bonus.
Definitely, and I suppose it's a great opportunity to plug, anyone that's listening that hasn't signed up as a member of the Rainbow Wall, please do so. Check them out on Twitter at the Rainbow Wall, and the join-in information will be on the profile there. Harry, coming over to you, I just wondered sort of, what change would you like to see, to make that game more inclusive within Wales?
I suppose it's sort of more visibility that clubs like our own sort of exist, and perhaps sort of like the awareness of that, and sort of easier to, if there are issues say in the stands watching a game or something, to be able to report it and it sort of know that it's going to be dealt with and not brushed aside, I suppose, because I think a lot of the past people sort of fear reporting anything that's going on in case, or like because nothing will be done with it, and that sort of puts them off being involved in games and things. And I think as well, because at recreational level or like casual level, because our team also have like a fives team, and which plays in goal in Leckwith near Kaiser Stadium, and there's like a few more like mixed teams that have sort of cropped up going to that as well, which is nice to see, because I think we were like one of the first with like having sort of trans people sort of playing, and it's nice to see that there's other people playing now, and sort of makes it feel safer that it's not just our own club sort of standing out like a sort of fun, I guess, that there are other teams and people that exist, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think that visibility, Harry, is really important, as you mentioned, and I think kind of, seeing the impact in recent months of some of the stuff that we've sort of been introducing, such as the Rainbow Wall, and obviously, visual awareness campaigns like the Football vs Homophobia campaign, and Natalie mentioned earlier, you know, as it stands, that the process, you know, it can be quite challenging for individuals to go through if they are a trans individual, and obviously be involved in football. And, you know, I think for quite a long period, we hadn't really had anyone that had sort of got in touch with us around, you know, going through that process and playing within the game and the sort of the authorised game within Wales. And Harry, obviously, as you said, the league that you play in your club, I suppose, is probably why that exists. But it's been quite interesting in recent months. We've seen a real surge of individuals. I think we've got 9 or 10 now people that have been in touch around that in the last 3 months. So I think some of that visibility, while on its own, you know, changing our social media icons, trying to point towards that, and things can be superficial and tokenistic in themselves. But I think consistently, and as long as it's kind of done in an authentic way, and things like the Rainbow War can have a big impact that, you know, hopefully is presenting that football can be a place where people can be part of and belong, irrespective of who they are or their identity and stuff. And I think that's certainly something that we've seen already is having a positive impact on, which is great. And Leo, I just wondered again, you know, what are some of your thoughts really in terms of, you know, what are still some of the changes that we need to really sort of make to try and, you know, shift forward from just talking about these things to actual real meaningful change?
Well, I think the thing is, I all my notes have already been taken by my fellow panelists, who've perfectly articulated what we need to be doing. But I think, you know, to Harry's point, visibility, and to your point as well, Jason. I know that about you know, you've talked to me about the impact that you're seeing on that already. I think greater education. So, you know, people tend to think, oh, it's a generational issue. Generation Z, they're already on it now and it's going to be okay. But actually, the research shows that there is this disparity between people's beliefs and then some of their behaviours and language, and the impact that has on people. So I still think there's work to be done to kind of educate people for change. I think better reporting. Can't remember who said that, Harry possibly. You know, yes, it was Harry. Definitely better reporting. People, you know, those systems being in Wales being really transparent, people knowing exactly what's going to happen at every step, and as Harry said, that's going to be taken seriously. And then underpinning that, there's some kind of more boring stuff around policies as well. I think, you know, particularly we're living in quite extraordinary times, I think, in terms of misinformation, particularly misinformation about trans participation in sport. And I think that we need to devise policies that reflect the lives and experiences of trans people. If we say we want to include trans people, we need to talk to trans people, we need to find out about their lived experience, and then we need to write a policy that is pertinent to that lived experience, and then we need to stand by it. Ultimately, you know, we need to make sure that you know, that we stand by our inclusion, and that we are really visible in that inclusion as well.
Yeah, and I certainly, you know, talk from our perspective, Lou, as you know, that everything we're trying to do is not sort of us sitting on our iron thrones at the Football Association, sort of dictating, you know, what we're doing or policies we're developing and stuff. You know, everything we're doing is certainly in collaboration with the LGBTQ community. Why we set up our LGBTQ Football Cymru network as well, and you know, that's certainly something that we're committed to make sure we're doing moving forward, and not just listening, but using that information and again to try and make some real meaningful change, which I think is really important. So kind of looking at then that, I know we've got people on the call tonight who are got various roles at clubs, or certainly might at some point be supporting an individual. So I just wonder what your sort of advice would be for an individual supporting someone who is either questioning their sexuality or their gender identity, and how they can kind of support them throughout that journey of coming out kind of within the game, and maybe using football as that tool to and the environment to try and maybe do that. Lou, I'll come to you first, so you're not last coming around on this one.
Okay, so I think just some key things are listen to people and listen to their experience. Try and learn more about the subject as well. And if you don't know the answers to everything, it's perfectly okay to say, actually, I feel a bit out of my depth. I don't really know what I'm doing here, but I'm going to go and find out some more. And I think people get really worried that they don't have the right language, that they don't know all the answers to everything. But absolutely, I think that LGBTQ plus people can tell when somebody's being authentic or not. So if you're authentic in your response, you don't know the answers to things, get some advice, get some information. Google can be your friend in some cases with some trusted resources. And I think the other thing is another key thing, and then the other panelists will undoubtedly have some great ideas and great responses, is make your support visible. So, LGBTQ plus people can be quite an invisible minority. And so visible shows of support can be really, really important for people. So I think that's really important. And also, once you're supporting an individual and you know what they want and what they want in terms of maybe communication with the wider team, that you make your support clear to fellow players. If you're a coach, and you've got a person who's come out to you, once that person says that they want the rest of the team to know they want to come out to them, we should be making sure as leaders in the game that we say and show that we are supporting LGBTQ plus individuals, and that we are allies, and that's really, really important.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's important having the individual's best interests at heart as well, and the focus on that. And it's not that kind of, that little bit of a virtue signal and the support person having a pat on their back, and I know I've said before that it's what people do when the cameras are not on them or when people are not looking. And I think that's really important. But, I think the key point from what you said there is the listening. And I think that's the starting point. Even if you don't know how to support or what to do, it's just being there to listen. And I think, that certainly can have a big impact. Was that something sort of in your experience, Natalie, in terms of anyone that supported yourself, or kind of what advice would you give based on your own personal experiences and expert knowledge for others to support somebody else as well?
Yeah, no, I obviously agree with everything that's been said, but I think there's a lot of stuff actually that can happen even before there is a questioning or an individual who's coming out to deal with, because I think you can help create a culture and environment where someone will feel safe to talk about that. So it's challenging that homophobic, transphobic language, even if you don't think there is a LGBTQ person there. Like, obvious, but actually, that can really make an impact. If a young person who's questioning sees a coach challenging some homophobic behaviour, straight away that person's going to think, okay, this is probably someone who gets it, this is probably someone who's going to be on my side. So that can be really, really powerful and can make a huge difference to somebody's life, honestly. So creating that culture beforehand, but I think as well, we talked about listening, but just listening to what people want, but actually being a bit curious and not being afraid to ask questions, obviously within reason, but asking questions, trying to say, how can I support you better? Is there something that I can do differently? I guess that standard stuff that's between a kind of a manager and a direct report, or a coach and a player or whatever, is how can I support you better? Is there ways in which I could modify my own behaviour? Is there ways in which I could work with somebody else to make your experience better? But yeah, I think a lot of it is, it doesn't even have to be a person. It's just, how can I create that culture? How can I create that environment that is going to be safe for everyone, that is going to mean that people are going to feel more comfortable disclosing that identity, if and when that arises.
Yeah, it's an important point, isn't it, Natalie? Is that cultural shift, is creating that environment where people are comfortable being themselves and having open and honest conversations. And I think Karis, who was due to be on the panel tonight, made a really important point in the comments, and said that sometimes people have to be willing to get things wrong. and sort of be comfortable with that as well, and being comfortable with having uncomfortable conversations. And sometimes the fear of getting things wrong sometimes stops people from educating themselves. I think it's trying to break down that barrier and almost be happy with being vulnerable. And as Lou sort of alluded to earlier, sometimes it's kind of, when you know someone's being authentic, they might still say the wrong thing or get something wrong. But I think if there's that willingness to learn and want to listen, then I think it's important that we see part of that personal growth for individuals as well, as long as obviously they're supporting someone moving forward as well.
Yeah, that, as I say, that being able to be a bit vulnerable and admit that you don't know something and being able to ask a question, that vulnerability is immensely powerful, because that allows other people to be a bit vulnerable, and it builds trust, doesn't it? So yeah, if you can, it's how you deal with those missteps sometimes that you may well make that can really show someone that you're someone that is willing to learn and willing to work with them and is safe. So
yeah, definitely. I think in such an area where these things are so individual for everyone as well, and it's impossible almost to have that blanket approach and having the same way of supporting every single person, because everyone is very, very different and will require different support as well. Tracy, have you got anything to add on some of those points?
Well, I think, to be quite honest, Lou and Natalie literally covered it all, almost. I've actually had, as running a group, I've actually had an email from someone who's actually just coming out and starting their journey, and they were basically just asking questions about meeting the group for the first time, and what's it like going to a game and being their authentic selves. And the first thing I said was that you don't have to rush out of the closet, so to speak. You don't have to tell the whole world on the same day. And I think Lou alluded to it earlier, you don't just come out once anyway. You consistently come out for many different reasons and to many different people through your life. And I said to them, look, it can start off with, I will just listen, get to know you. We take it from there. And then if you want to just meet me on my own, that is fine to begin with, if that makes you feel more comfortable. So then we can have an open dialogue and conversation. And then if you want to go to meet in the group fully, we can do that. But it's all in your own time. If you have any questions, ask, because it's the best thing to do is keep that dialogue open. It's not easy. I mean, I was lucky in my journey. It was easy for me because there's several gay people in my family, to be quite honest. I'm not the only one. But for many, that journey isn't easy. And we had a trans member speak to me several times who still is so afraid to come to a game. And that actually really upsets me. And it's still a conversation we just have every now and again. I get an email, a little conversation, and then I don't hear anything for a while. And again, eventually, hopefully, with that dialogue kept open, things will change. But I do feel like the game also needs to adapt along the way as well to make people feel 100% comfortable, because I don't quite think we're there yet. But the work that we're all doing, and the reason we're doing panels like this, is to create an environment that is and feels safer.
Yeah, definitely. Harry, what's your thoughts on that? So what support do you think people can give others?
I think most of it has sort of already been said, but I guess in terms of be it at football training, that kind of environment, sort of normalizing asking people the names and pronouns kind of thing when you start, if you've got a bunch of new people joining and things, and sort of not being afraid to mess up and being patient and listening, and as everyone has sort of already said. But yeah,
brilliant, thanks. Sort of a final question point before we take some questions from the listeners. So last chance to get some questions in if you're listening in. What sort of final words of advice would you give for somebody who might be at the start of their journey, or again, for those listening in, might be already supporting somebody at the start of their journey? Come to you, maybe Natalie first.
Find my unmute button. Be careful about going to me first, because I'll ramble on that. But I think it's difficult to give advice to someone just starting out, because obviously, depending on what their thinking about coming out for is very different. I think what I would say is I've got so much out of being involved in football. I don't tend to go and watch many games because there's this weird dichotomy, isn't there? You get people that play, you get people that watch. I guess you can't do both because they tend to be going on at the same time. But I've got so much out of it. I've got so many people I would never have met, so many friends I would never have made, so much personal growth. And Tracy talks about this earlier, but there's so much personal growth from having been involved in conversations like this, but also just like the self-analysis that you go through coming out and explaining to people what things are about. You understand. So I almost think it's a privilege in a way that we get to go through this experience of disclosing our identities to people and learning over again who we are. There's so much great stuff that you get out of that like I know it often to people really doesn't seem like a privilege, and it really doesn't seem like an opportunity, but there is so much opportunity in there. And I don't want to erase the fact that for a lot of people there's a lot of traumatic side to it as well. But I think there's an awful lot of great stuff you can get around being involved in a sport, being involved in a community in some way, that I would really just encourage people to kind of take the plunge and find a way that works for them. See, I ramble.
No, that's fine. Thanks, Natalie. Tracy, you already shared some positive examples, again, as being a fan, and where, groups like the Rainbow War, for example, can kind of be a really positive one. But any sort of additional sort of final words of advice for any fans listening in?
I think for me, what it's done for me is it's given me, I suppose I felt when I went and started doing my work in football, I felt like I gained a community. And I've learned so much along the way, and I feel I'm still learning. And I get questions by other supporters about even things like pronouns, where they know nothing and they keep getting them wrong and they're worried. And I'm like, well, if you notice you're getting them wrong, you apologise and you're learning. And the fact that you've noticed you're getting them wrong, great, you're learning. And I feel like I've learned so much in my journey. I feel if anyone wants to start that journey themselves, definitely join in a LGBTQ plus supporters group. They will as well get a community around a subject they obviously love if they're going to football, and they'll learn so much. And they won't just learn so much, they'll teach others as well. And that's the whole point of that sort of equality, inclusion. It's just bringing everything together, and it's only a positive. So for me, if anyone watching, if you're not part of an LGBTQ plus supporters group, if you've got one for your team, join if you'd like. And again, if you want to play football, I feel like I'm way too old to play football now. And when I played, I had to watch the boys play. I played with them, and then I had to watch the games on weekends because I wasn't allowed to join in, and I'm still sulky about that. There's so many great clubs now that allow you to do that. So take the plunge if you feel comfortable to.
And it's a great time now where in Wales we've got Cardiff City, Swansea City, Wrexham and Newport County all with their own LGBTQ supporters club, plus obviously the Rainbow War for our national teams, which is over the last 6 months roughly or so now has been set up. So it's a great time if you follow any of those clubs within Wales. But yeah, Tracy, as you mentioned, there's lots of other clubs that do have supporters groups as well. So please reach out to them. I'm sure it's something that you won't regret. So moving on to some listener questions. So we've got a question around, so someone made sort of notes of the comments earlier around the persistent chants, making people feel uncomfortable, and the constant coming out being tiring really resonated with them. Do the panel think there's anything that can be done to tackle these barriers and attitudes? And how can we help improve education for people within the game? As I find most of the time, people aren't intentionally malicious, just uneducated through ignorance. Just so thanks for sharing all of your experiences. So kind of two parts of that. Maybe Trace, coming towards you for the first part, maybe around that.
So what was the first part of the question?
No, it's okay.
There was a lot there, and I'm used to this question quite a bit.
That's fine. So you mentioned with the persistent chants, making people feel uncomfortable, but also the constant coming out being tiring. Do you think is there anything that can be done to tackle these barriers and attitudes?
Education. education. It's that, and that I think I say that word consistently when it comes to these sort of subjects. And actually, as much as it's education, we need people in the authorities to actually take this chance seriously. And by authorities, I mean to be able to prosecute these, because if we give the powers that be to be able to prosecute, then we can get clubs and the FAs, we can give them more power to actually do something about this. And a lot of it is education. I know a lot of songs are sung and they will never even know. Definitely younger people who go to grounds will join a song, will sing a song, not knowing where the song started from, not having a clue. And then they're told it's a discrimination in one way or another. And then they get defensive because, they don't see it that way. And that's where education comes in. I think as fan groups, we try to educate as much as we can. Clubs can obviously put out material, definitely around match days where they can put pieces in programs. But it's, I think, on the larger scale, definitely, if we're going to go out of the Welsh side but go to the Chelsea side, we are working very hard to get the CPS to actually take the Chelsea Rent Boy chant the Rent Boy chant as a whole as being homophobic, because they don't see it that way. How you don't see that as being homophobic, I'm not sure, but they don't. And if we want to really make a difference, we need to make a difference at the top, so that when that comes down, if people consistently keep bringing discrimination to the game and we try to educate and that doesn't work, that then prosecutions as a last resort can then be taken, because I truly believe you have to educate to begin with. And that's in clubs, that's staffing grounds, and more importantly, it's the stewarding within a game, and they need to be trained to recognise all forms of discrimination so that actually action can be taken in grounds.
Yeah, I completely agree, Tracy. And it's why sort of education and awareness is one of the 4 core areas around our ADI strategy. And I think that quite often sort of intent gets brought up quite a lot in instances someone didn't intend to mean it maliciously, but I think it's really important and really want to emphasize that for that individual that term is targeted towards or impacts, to them intent doesn't matter. It can be hugely damaging, and quite often individuals can have a particular word said towards them intently a number of times every day even. So after a while it gets difficult to differentiate between those times where someone is being intentful and malicious or whether they're not, and the word carries such degradation and sort of real impact as well. But I think education is certainly important, particularly around chants, as you said, Tracy. I think is trying to unpick the historical context.
And there's also a fine line though between banter and abuse, by the way, and discrimination, and that line, I swear, has got thinner. And it's just knowing, there's plenty of songs that every fan club can sing that don't have any form of discrimination. There's plenty. We should all be singing positive songs about our own club rather than focusing on the negative in songs and chants, when there's plenty of positive stuff we could be saying.
I think there's always another way. There's always a better way in it. I suppose is the key point within that one. I suppose Tracy sort of answered the question really around the education. But Lou, I just wonder whether you had any points as a campaign around the importance of the education and how it can be done. Obviously, you're aware of some of the stuff that we're doing, like the session tonight. But is there anything else around that really?
Yeah, I suppose, if you look at the Football versus Homophobia website, we've got quite a few resources on our website. So we've got some leaflets for children in kind of key stage 2, so year 5 and 6. So, under 11s and under 10s football ages. We've also got, leaflets that specifically speak to kind of teenagers. And then we've got, a load of resources that then speak to adults as well. But we've also got other stuff that's kind of downloadable on our website. So I was taking part in something this week, and somebody said that they'd downloaded all the infographics from our from Natalie's Football versus Transphobia campaign, and they'd circulated those around the staff team, you know, in their workplace. So so yeah, there are increasing kind of resources available to people. You know, FEH Cymru, we offer a whole range of kind of you know, training programs, workshops for clubs, community foundations, you know, a whole range of things, from sort of, you know, a 20-minute intervention for stewards to a 2-hour workshop for people who are kind of like working full-time in football. But I suppose from what I would say in Wales is that, you know, that there are great things happening in Wales at the moment. You know, we've got the Rainbow Wall, you know, that's really fantastic. We've also got the Cymru network for Welsh football, LGBTQ plus network. And if there's anybody kind of on the call tonight who wants to join that, that would be fantastic. You know, more voices, more people involved in that would be absolutely great. And one of the brilliant things about those sessions is that we learn about the great work that's happening around Wales. So there's some fantastic stuff happening in junior football up in North Wales at the moment that we've learned about through that network. So yeah, there's lots of access to education, lots of access to good people in Wales who are trying to do good work. So reach out either to Jason via the PALB email address or to FEH Cymru.
Yeah, definitely, Neil. And I think one of the stories that really stood out from one of the recent meetings was a club, as you mentioned, in North Wales that set up a youth forum and had sort of you know, young people who would, you know, either gone through the journey of coming out to their parents or their friends, you know, within the club at school, and we're almost sort of mentoring other younger players in the club who were sort of questioning their sexuality, who going through the same process. So you know, there's some great work that is certainly going on out there as well. The next question, I'll read it out, but I think we can shift it a little bit. It's quite a common one. Around, do you think we're anywhere near a point where a player in a professional male game could come out whilst playing? I wonder whether this sort of shifted a little bit to, you know, I think particularly during the recent Euros, there was a lot more players as allies supporting the sort of LGBTQ community. Which was fantastic. I mean, Gareth Bale, for example, ourselves wore the Pride armband in a friendly against France, which is the first time, to my knowledge, that our men's team sort of involved in that. We've got some plans coming up now in November. I wonder whether, you know, is it a case that the more we get some of those players who are not necessarily identified as part of the community as allies, that might give that visibility, that it will be accepted within the game, then we might see that finally happening? Or is that not? What do you guys think on that one, really? I'm
happy to start. If you
go on, Natalie.
So I was going to say, I think you've identified a really important thing there, which is actually more allies coming out. And I say coming out, you know, coming out as an ally, and if that's the thing. But, you know, because we have to remember, ultimately, like, that's a workplace like anything else. If people in your workplace come out and say, look, I am wholly supportive of your identity and whoever you are, you know, that's cool with me, that can be really powerful. So I think the more we see of that, the better. And clearly that's going to have a big impact on how safe somebody feels coming out, whilst, you know, a man feels coming out whilst they're still playing. So I think the more that governing bodies, sponsors, media companies can do to facilitate that I've seen some stuff that's been done that's actually had some really mature conversations with either currently active or recently active kind of ex-pros on talking about people in their family perhaps that have come out and talking about the experiences that they've seen through that. So I think that can be really powerful. Are we close to a player in the professional male league coming out whilst playing? I honestly, I've changed my viewpoint on this quite a lot, but I think we're a bit further than people think we are. I think a lot of people think we're just around the corner. I'm not sure we are, because I still think they would face quite a lot of discrimination. You know, as Tracy's talked about, some of the chanting we see in the stadiums, you can imagine there is no way that opposition fans would not, you know, have some quite abusive chanting sometimes. It's unfortunate to say. It's an international game, and you know we've seen what happens sometimes at away international games and stuff like that. I'm not absolving, you know, our home countries of our responsibility that as well in saying that, but I think there would be an awful lot of abuse would still happen, and I think what was interesting is I've never been in that environment. I don't know how accommodating dressing rooms would be. There are definitely some great examples, you know, in the club game, for example, like Jordan Henderson's been quite visible at Liverpool. There's been, you know, not just him, there's lots of other people at other clubs as well. But would they all be like that? I really don't know. I think it's not a huge leap to imagine that there would still be some considerable resistance in dressing rooms as well. So it's not something that I think is around the corner. And the other thing I always say to this is, even if it does come along, doesn't mean it's solved. And it doesn't mean that the problems go away overnight. And in fact, it might even be worse. You know, there's an awful lot of pressure on the first person who comes out, and every utterance on the subject is jumped upon and taken as a gospel from the LGBTQ community. And can you imagine coming out in the public eye like that? It's an immense amount of pressure, and that person will make missteps. And so, yeah, it's a big and complicated topic. I'm just interested in what other people have to say as well.
I think, if I can kind of chip in, that I think that when we think about footballers coming out, what we kind of tend to imagine is there's a rational adult who's kind of like stepped into football from absolutely nowhere, and then they just have to make a decision about whether they're going to come out or not. And what we don't think is about the people in professional football, the men in professional male football, you know, in Wales, in England, in the UK, have come through a system. And that system has been, I can absolutely tell you, highly prescriptive around the type of masculinity that is allowed to be expressed in those environments. And more often than not, will have had casual homophobia used on a daily basis. And so actually, we're not talking about somebody who's parachuted into football with none of these effects. We're talking about somebody who's grown up in a really particular environment. And if we look at the testimonies of professional footballers who've come out, you know, you look at Robbie Rogers, who came out, left the game, and then kind of went back into the game and played for LA Galaxy. You know, when he was playing, you know, he talks about in his autobiography that he learned from a really young age what it meant to be different. And from that moment, he was consumed with fear, you know. So for him, it wasn't just about, oh, am I going to go out on the football pitch and people are going to sing horrible chants? It was like from a really young child, he knew that it wasn't acceptable to be gay. And so he struggled with that and struggled with that. I mean, the average age of coming out in the UK at the moment is 15. And, you know, we should have loads of out gay players in junior football if the environment wasn't still quite a toxic environment for young people to be in, if young people didn't feel that there were penalties to be had by being different and being differently male, being different, having a different sexuality. So I think if we want to see players come out, then we've got to do work in academies, and especially with coaches.
And I think it was such a really good important point for us to end on, almost that call to action. I know we've got grassroots clubs listening in tonight, and no doubt those will watch this, you know, following the recording of this tonight. And I think it's important that, you know, quite often we focus when we talk about, you know, male players coming out or any player coming out, we focus on the top end, the professional players, and sort of seeing them and those players who are not part of the LGBTQ community as being allies. But for me, anyone can be a role model. And I think actually people within the smallest grassroots club in Wales can be massive role models, you know, for other people to follow their lead as well. And I think it's so important that we have to continue to focus on creating the right environment. The smallest, you know, youngest age group club right the way up to all of our professional clubs and our national teams as well, because as you rightly said, Lou, those young players are the ones that are going to be progressing through all the way up. They don't just suddenly get dropped into the senior sort of first team. So I think that's certainly important, and why we have to continue and some of the good work that's already been doing, but having more clubs to be proactive in increasing their visibility, their education, educating their players, their members around this and everything that we've spoken about tonight, so that we can try and continue to develop that environment where we get to that point, as we've mentioned, and wanted to sort of mention, we're not there yet, but around trying to create an environment where football really can be a place for everyone, everywhere in Wales at every level, where everyone can be the best version of themselves, but do it by being themselves. And I think that's quite a key point to end on, really. Just wanted to have a massive thank you to our panelists and our guests tonight, Natalie, Lou, Harry and Tracy. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing some personal experiences, but certainly a lot of advice for our listeners on the call tonight. So thank you for participating in tonight's session as part of the National Coming Out Day. We've got lots of educational sessions coming up, so please keep checking out on our socials and on our website, and we'll certainly have a range of further workshops working with football versus homophobia, and also heading towards the awareness weeks as well in the new year. So thank you everyone for tuning in tonight, and hopefully catch you again soon. Bye bye.